So, spare the rod and spoil the child. Money is the root of all evil. God helps those who help themselves. If a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. These are all deeply held biblical teachings that are not in the Bible, or at least not in the way that I just said them. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the working conditions described in Thessalonians, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, specifically verse 10. But I just want to point out as we dive in here, frequently there are doctrinal positions developed and espoused among believers that are taken from not necessarily what a verse says, but what someone said that it said, or someone extrapolated from what was said and turned it into a whole doctrine that winds up actually contradicting what Scripture clearly said. So let's dive in and take a look at what was happening. So Paul writes to the Thessalonians, not for the first time, but at least the second time, and says to them that they should avoid people who walk in idleness. And he goes on to say, remember, when we were there with you, not even we walked in idleness. We occupied ourselves with work. We made sure that we were able to support ourselves. We didn't take a morsel from you without paying for it, because the last thing that we wanted to do was to be a burden on you, the church there in that community. And that brings us then to the famous verse 10 in chapter 3. And this is my translation. For indeed, when we were with you, this we were commanding you. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, or neither should he eat. Either translation would be sort of accurate there. So, during Paul and company's time in Thessaloniki, they proclaimed a policy. And let's take a look at this. It says here, tuto parangelomen humin. This we were commanding you. Parangelomen is an imperfect active indicative, first person plural. The imperfect tense communicates linear action in the past, something that was happening in the past, but it was ongoing. If Paul would have said in the aorist, in the simple past, we commanded you then. But what he said is, we were commanding you or instructing you while we were there. It's not a commandment in the religious sense, antole. It's not teaching in a doctrinal sense, didache. Parangelomen is we were instructing alongside. The message alongside you was this. While we were sort of teaching in situ, while we were there with you, we were continually telling you to do this thing. And so what does that tell us? That it was continual and not a simple past thing. It was an issue when they were there, to the point that they talked about it more than once. It was an ongoing issue while they were there, and it's still an issue. How do we know it's still an issue? If it wasn't still an issue, he's not taking up writing time and space on valuable, expensive written communication to talk about it again. So he's talking about it again. He talked about it perpetually while he was there. It was an issue, and it's still an issue. So let's look at the thing that they were commanded. Hoti etis uthele, ergazesthai, not ergazesthai, mede esthieto. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, neither should he eat. Let's break it down. So hoti is used like a quotation mark. That first word in the phrase, hoti, it's not part of the translation. It's introducing the thing that they were commanding while they were there with them. Then we get atis, if anyone. The unaccented tis always introduces uncertainty. So not a specific person, but this applies to anyone who fits the condition. If anyone there in the community does what? uthele, is not willing. So if anyone is not continually willing, comes from thelo, means I wish, I will, or I desire. So what's the group of people covered by this uncertain, this if? The condition is if anyone is continually unwilling to work, ergasisthai, which is a present infinitive, to work. Anyone who is unwilling on an ongoing basis to work, then we get to the big payoff, let him not eat. But the critical thing for us to look at here today is the dominance of thelo over ergasisthai. The important issue in the sentence for Paul is this unwillingness to work. He establishes what's called grammatically a first-class condition, and that just means that it's presumed to be true for argument's sake. Anyone who is we presume to be really not willing to work shouldn't get to eat. If it were a second-class condition, that would mean we presume it's untrue for the sake of argument. And then there are third-class conditions that take place in the subjunctive mood and the optative mood and things like that, but that doesn't apply here. So, assumed to be true for argument's sake, there are people, pardon my nose scratch, there are people in the community who are both unwilling to work, but are continuing to eat in the community meal. And Paul says, if they're continually unwilling to work, they shouldn't have access to that meal. So in English, we tend to take the word will for granted. If we say someone who will not work, they shouldn't eat, we sort of equate will not work with the same thing as does not work. But in Koine, we're getting the extra word here, thele, telling us that we're talking about desire, wish, will, an act of the will, someone who does not desire to work. That's not the same thing as someone who just doesn't work. And if we have to see that word as being incredibly important because it tells us about the person and not just the activity of the person. So what is their orientation? Their orientation is unwillingness to work, which is not the same thing as doesn't work. I want to take a little journey out of Thessalonians for a moment into Matthew in our minds. I'll encourage you when this is over to go read Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 3 for yourselves. But here, I'm just going to describe it quickly and talk about the use of this word thelo within Matthew 8, 1 through 3. So in Matthew, Jesus is coming down the mountain, huge multitude is with him, when he's approached by a leper who comes up, parts the crowd, kneels before Jesus, and says to him these words. He says, Lord, if you are willing, eon thele, if you are willing, theles, pardon me, if you are willing, if you wish it, if you will it, if you desire it, you are able to make me clean. So he says, I don't doubt your ability to make me clean, but I don't know about your willingness to make me clean. Lord, Kyrie, if you are willing, eon theles, you are able to make me clean. And then Jesus looks at him and says, it says he stretches out his hands and touches the leper and says to him, Thelo, I desire, I am willing. And then he says, katharistati, be cleansed, an imperative. Yes, I am willing, be cleansed. So it all comes down to the leper's concern, right? The leper's concern isn't with his ability, the leper's concern is with his willingness. And Jesus responds to that by declaring his willingness, Thelo, I am willing, and demonstrating his willingness by issuing the imperative, be cleansed, and we're told immediately the leper was cleansed. Magnificent stuff. Let's go back to 2 Thessalonians 3:10. So the issue here is the willingness to work, not the ability to work. So look at these two alternate ways of phrasing the verse that were available to Paul. He could have said, etis ou ergatzetai, which means if anyone doesn't work. Okay? If we leave thelo out of it, we take the willingness out of it, Paul could have easily said, if anyone doesn't work, he shouldn't eat, or let him not eat. But that's not what he said, right? We know what he said, and it wasn't if anyone doesn't work. He also could have said, etis ou escue ergatsasthai, if anyone is unable to work. And escue, coming from escuo, deals with a person's inner resources, their strength, their capacity, their competence, their ability to do something. So this would be a way of saying, if anyone lacks the ability, if anyone has a disability that keeps them from being able to work, let him not eat. But that's not what Paul said, right? We know what he said. He said, if anyone is perpetually unwilling to work, he shouldn't eat, let him not eat. So why does this matter? The prohibition for eating is for anyone with a perpetual unwillingness, not someone who isn't able to work due to a disability or isn't able to work due to the scarcity of work or isn't able to work because of persecution of Christians. We're talking about a person who in their willingness, in their desires, has made the determination that they don't want to do this thing. That's very different. And now let's get to the prohibition itself. Mede esthieto. So mede is compound, may, not, or no, de, and, or but. So but not, esthieto, is an imperative. It's a present imperative, let him eat. And when we have that may put together with a present tense imperative, we get a vibe. We get the cessation of an activity already in progress. Because you've heard me say 100 times, the present tense deals with linear, continual things. So the may brings a stop to something that is continual when it's paired up with a present tense imperative. So what's the vibe? The vibe is stop continuing to let him eat. And a native Koine speaking and reading audience would get that vibe. They would pick that up. It's a little more complex for us where Koine is a second or third language, and we have to look at this thing and see it for what it is. What Paul is saying is, if someone has a perpetual unwillingness to work, you have to stop continually letting that person eat. In other words, Paul recognizes that if there's someone in the Christian community, in the faith community, this gracious, loving, caring community in which everyone is holding all things in common and supporting each other, if someone is there with a continual unwillingness to work, taking that care for granted, you have to stop continuing to let that person eat. This is kind of fascinating because it raises the question, is that for the sake of the church? Is that for the sake of the person? Is that for the sake of the appearance of what the church represents in the world? Is that for the survival of the community? Is that so people don't become embittered toward those who come seeking aid? It's slightly unclear, but one thing we can take away from the previous verses is Paul said he himself didn't want to be a burden on the church, and therefore recognizes that a church that's burdened by sort of free riders could suffer damage that's not good for the church. But I'm reading this as an old alcoholic. And I hear in Paul's writing the message of an intervention. And this is speculation on my part. Do with it what you will. Read it for yourself and come to your own conclusion. But it sounds to me like the language of an intervention, where the intervention comes to the conclusion, those participating in an intervention come to the conclusion that they are loving someone to death, that they are helping someone to death, that they have to get to a place where they stop enabling the behavior that's not good for the person and is also creating harm for the support group around the person. Everyone's heard the term rock bottom, right? And what I can tell you from my own personal experience and from working with alcoholics and addicts for years, when someone is approaching their rock bottom, there's almost always another person or persons around them that start throwing pillows on the rocks to make sure that the person has a softer landing. They don't want to see the person get hurt. But what they don't understand is those pillows are prolonging the agony. That frequently the effort to keep the person from feeling the full pain of their situation lets them stay in the situation longer. And so perhaps Paul is saying it's important for us to understand as a faith community that when someone has found that there is safety inside the faith community, that despite their perpetual unwillingness to work, we'll always let them come and eat. We're letting them stay in this bad mindset longer than they need to. And we should stop letting them keep coming to eat, because they'll eventually get hungry enough to say, oh, even the apostles when they were here took care of themselves and didn't make themselves a burden on the community. This only works if we're all contributing and are mutually supportive. Sometimes somebody goes through a period where they need more support than others, and the rest come to the rallying support of that person. But a person who comes along and says, hey, you know what? I figured out that I can free ride forever here. These people are so kind and loving and gracious that there's no need for me to not free ride. Paul says, you must stop continuing to let such a person eat. You're going to help them right to death. And you're creating a burden on the faith community. What is Paul not doing? Paul's not trying to establish public policy. He's not saying the Roman Empire should adopt this posture. He may feel that, he may think that, you may feel that, you may think that, but that's not what he's doing. He's writing to the faith community in Thessaloniki and telling them how they should deal with someone who has a perpetual unwillingness to work. He's not establishing even a work ethic per se. He saw a problem when he was there. It seems that it's still a problem, and he writes a corrective. He establishes a condition and how they should deal with that condition in the faith community. Anyone with a persistent, perpetual unwillingness to work, not an inability, not a lack of opportunity, has to be stopped from eating for the good of the church and for the good of the person. Now, I would encourage you to go read verses 11 through 15, because he doesn't leave it there. He doesn't end there. He encourages the church to counterbalance this teaching with an admonition for care and concern and gentleness. He's not saying boot them out on their ear. He's not saying throw them to the wolves. He's not saying throw them down on the hard rocks so they hit rock bottom. He's saying there's a way to deal with these people so that they can be reincorporated into the community of faith and they can participate fully and not just as hangers-on. Thanks for watching today, and if this was good for you, please hit the like, subscribe, share, and all that good stuff. Tell a friend, leave a comment telling me what you think, and I'll see you again next time. Until then, Charis Kai Rene Humin, grace and peace to you.